Okay guys, we're back. I hope you guys enjoyed it and got a new perspective. Now we'll be passing on to our first segment, Coffee Time. This week on our Coffee Time, I was able to spend time with Dr. Costantinos, Pan-Africanist, author, also economist. He's really engaged in topics related to Africa, and I was able to get a very new perspective about our continent. And we had this conversation that was basically outside of the box, a very kind of thing. Let's pass on to that, and we'll be back. Thank you so much, sir, for coming today.
Well, thank you for having me.
I tried to explain and say a bit things about you, but could you tell for our audience about yourself?
Well, my name is Costantinos. I've been working with the United Nations in New York as senior policy advisor, and of course in many other African countries with the United Nations Development Program. And then I've worked also as the chairperson of the advisory board for anti-corruption of the African Union for 2 terms. Now I'm involved in teaching public policy at the postgraduate level, running humanitarian organizations, and of course a little bit of private sector think tanks.
Wow, I'm jealous because you are literally in many things that we can impact Africa with. So my first question is, I don't want to go around the bush and just take some light questions as a first one. And currently, as we know, in our country, Ethiopia, the dollar price is going high, not only here in Ethiopia, but also in other African countries. So we all know that African economy is not free from intervention, even at this time. With different financial aids, loans, our voice is being overheard by other bodies. So how can our economy as an Africans be free from any intervention, and how can we get that economic freedom that we need to have?
Well, I think primarily looking at Africa as one country is a big mistake. We're not yet there for the kind of unity that the African Union is wishing to have by 2063. So African countries differ from one country to the other. We have countries that have been colonized, of course, almost all of them, except Ethiopia and Liberia. We have countries which have had good governance for a long period of time. We had countries that have been subjected to different kinds of post-colonial manipulation, military governments. We have multiple coups and counter-coups going on today, like in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. Recently, actually, we had 9 countries that had military coups. And of course, we have Sudan, which is now completely a fragile, failed state. So in terms of the kind of economic independence, Africa is rich in resources, there is no question about it. It has probably the largest arable land, water resource, mineral resource, rare earth minerals, power generation, whatever you call it. The problem has been governance within Africa. For one, you know, the post-independence leaders, when they came to form the Organization of African Unity, that's exactly what they had in mind, a united Africa that would be independent from colonial rule and neo-colonial rule, which is happening today. So Africa has been a playground for different powers at different times. Specifically during the Cold War, it was between the Soviet Union and the Western world. And now Africa is a victim of the exploitation that's happening. Let's take the Democratic Republic of Congo. On paper, it's the richest country in the world. It has minerals worth almost $30 trillion. But on Human Development Index, it's the poorest country in the world. So the kind of conflicts you have in the DRC, the kind of manipulations you had in the different governments you had in the DRC, we had Mobutu Sese Seko, who literally destroyed the country. And then finally Kabila came, and it didn't make much of a difference. And now they're trying to do something. But you know, the M23 rebels that are fighting in northern Kivu and northern part of Congo are the most serious problem for that country. If you see other countries, Central African Republic is rich in minerals again, but it has conflicts. If you see now, 39 out of 54 countries are in some kind of political crisis. So there is no way Africans can be economically independent when you have this kind of problems that are ongoing. And of course, the second thing is some of these conflicts are now being inflamed by the very people who are supposed to support these countries. That's why now Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, they have literally said this is the second independence. They have taken out colonial powers, former colonial powers out of their countries, and they have taken charge of their country again. But definitely, if you see the history of Africa, foreign powers have been intervening, even financing military coups and counter coups. And therefore, the leadership of the African Union also hasn't fared very well in a sense, because the African Union Commission is the central organ of all the organs of the African Union. But the point is, the African Union is led by the member states more than an organization that can stand on its own. And therefore, it has become incapable of imposing certain strategic and tactical issues into African governance. The only thing is, it's a secretariat to accomplish what the summits of the African Union decide. So now, with the new leadership coming in next year, I'm hoping that the African Union will have a better leadership, and that can convince heads of state and governments to be able to accept some international norms so that Africa could get out of this neo-colonial quagmire.
So I do believe that creating that economic connections and interdependency among African countries is really important, because if we are connected through economy, then whether we like it or not, we're all one. And the whole point is not about creating one whole system, but it's about creating a natural and healthy dependency among each other. But in order to create that, even when we talk about governance, there needs to be some certain of consciousness or awareness that we need to have, so that we understand who we are as a nation, who we are as a human being, so that's when we can really unleash the power that we have. So how can we create that African consciousness to make African Renaissance come a bit faster? Do you have any reflections on that?
Well, you see, the point is, the initiative undertaken by African leaders during the decolonization process, Emperor Haile Selassie led this process here in Addis Ababa. That's why we have the Organization of African Unity Office here, and now the African Union. And their belief and vision was to free Africa from all kinds of political, cultural, economic pressures that were coming specifically from Europe at that time as a colonizing power. Now, since then, things have changed. The Cold War put Africa into a place where some of them became supporters of the Western side, some of them became on the Eastern side, on the Soviet Union side. Now, conceptually, the African Union was supposed to lead the way for the kind of psychological independence of the African mind, for the kind of the African Renaissance that was being widely tutored by people like President Mbeki from South Africa. But that imagination, I think, has faded away now, because if you see, when summits are being organized by the United States, by Russia, by China, by France, by Italy, Turkey, even South Korea, all African head of states go there. I don't know how many African head of states even come to the African Union meetings here in Addis Ababa or any other place in Africa. So the kind of leadership we have in this continent are not the kind of Pan-Africanist leaders who would want to see a united Africa, and not only a united Africa, but the unity of the colored race within the world. So that, the history of slavery, the history of colonialism, the history of oppression, the history of exploitation can be behind us. I remember 2 French presidents have said that France would be a third world country if Africa was not there. The United Kingdom is built on African resources. So now, as you see, Europe is not gaining ground in terms of its economic prowess because of the African governments, some of them denying Western powers access to their resources anymore. West African countries didn't even have their own central banks to make their own monetary policy. Their central bank was in Paris. All these countries that you find the Francophone in West Africa. So all their central banks were in Paris. And they didn't have, that means they couldn't make monetary policy. Their money was pegged to the French franc, and finally it was pegged to the euro. They're trying to get out of that and create a West African currency, but it's not working. So simple issues like sovereignty and identity have not been even assured in some of these countries. So to develop the kind of Pan-Africanist view, to develop our resources so that Africa is not a victim of, let's say, climate change, for example, or a victim of international trade wars between China and the United States. We need the kind of leadership that would push us into this, because Africa has this agricultural land, has minerals, has water, has everything. And more important, Africa has a young population. Now, the Europeans, the majority of the workforce is going into retirement. Even China is facing that kind of problems. So with the demographic decline that you see in the developed nations, Africa now is the next pole for growth and investment. 70% of our population are young people. These are people who can work, and thanks to the internet and social media revolution, now you can see young people going into financial technology, fintech startups. So it is these young people who could have a vision for a united Africa now. The older generation were focused on power struggle to maintain themselves at the helm of everything, political power, and eventually loot this country, loot their country and go somewhere else. But that's not happening today now, because most countries wouldn't even accept dictators to go to their own countries. The other problem is when even some people want to stand up for African unity. I'll tell you one example. Gaddafi was not a good person for his own people. He spent 42 years in power, and he became literally a kind of an almighty for his population. But he was a Pan-Africanist. And finally, it is his Pan-Africanist feeling that NATO took a decision to just bomb him down into oblivion. And the sad thing is, not even a single African country took any action to prevent this. So when it comes down to Africa identifying itself with its own resources, with its own history, with its own culture, then the West even has the capacity to send NATO to bomb nations, peaceful nations, without any question. And therefore, superpower now, what we have today, probably after the Ukraine war, is that we have a multilateral world emerging. On one side, you have Russia and China emerging in unison. On the other side, you have the West, which always existed. So the point might be now that NATO cannot act unilaterally anymore. The other powers might come in and say, stop this, don't do this. But Africans, some of the efforts that we had, for example, in Burkina Faso by Thomas Sankara, they got him killed. In DRC, the country that I mentioned, Lumumba's country, they got him killed. These colonial powers are still with their kind of tentacles everywhere within the African continent. And therefore, that will be very, very, very difficult for us to be able to unify psychologically, culturally within this continent and push for longer development.
Yeah, I think it's breaking down the whole work that we need to do into individual. Like when I do the psychological change, when I decide, when I start to know and ask, when I do the steps, when I take the steps as an African, as an individual, that I think I can be able to make the change. Now we see the whole thing as bulk, as the way it is, that sometimes it's exhausting to think that it's going to happen. Especially what I believe personally is that if one country is economically free, then the politics and also the social structure will come by itself. So could you tell us the impact or the role of economy in creating strong political and social foundation?
Well, definitely there is an ongoing debate between what comes first, the economy or democracy, and of course, what kind of democracy. We can talk about so many kinds of examples of democracy in this world: social democrats, Christian democrats, laissez-faire democracy. And of course, President Xi in China thinks the Chinese kind of democracy is the best democracy in the world, although they don't have any kinds of elections or political parties. So Africa, in terms of economic growth, in terms of GDP, 5, 6 countries in Africa are in the top 10 of GDP growing countries in the world. That's not surprising given the fact that some of them have natural resources that they sell, so they get money freely. Some of them are working very hard on their economy. But on the governance side, you see, you always have elections in countries, but elections, they are a very important part of any democratic process, but they're not the only process in a democracy. You see people rigging elections, you see they're using their ethnic background as a major way to win, and therefore Africa has not been governed properly in terms of economic governance. Otherwise, most African countries cannot be as poor as they are if the economic governance side alone was good enough. As I told you earlier, we have a huge young population in Africa. The problem now with this young population is they are educated, they have access to the internet, to social media. And as you educate people, their demands become more critical. Their demands become more intelligent. And governments are not able to answer these questions anymore. It's not a question of bread and fuel and prices and inflation anymore. It's a question of identity. It's a question of who we are as Africans. It's a question of where our country is heading. But the problem is you have also the armed wings within any society who are very disruptive and who are ready to intervene at any time using their guns. We just saw in Bangladesh 3 weeks of riots, and the Prime Minister had to run away from the country. But how many people were killed? We saw in Kenya recently. Young people who were promised by the same president, who is now an incumbent, and President Ruto, that he would be improving the economic conditions of the people, just turned away completely and started doing the opposite. So we had the riots, more than 30 people were killed. Now, with President Ruto, after he came back from the United States, a week later, the country is in shambles. Stock markets went flat, and the currency went haywire. Therefore, the economic opportunities for Africa to grow are there. We have the minerals. For example, the energy transition today to address climate change, we have the kind of minerals that would help us produce what you call the batteries for electric cars in the Congo, everywhere. One thing that should be demanded of the African governments is they should be governing as if they were elected by their own people. but now they are governing as dictators. They're there on the look for any kind of coups and military coups. Even the African Union has a declaration against coup d'etats, and it has suspended now countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Gabon, Sudan, and others from the African Union. So what I believe is very soon these countries are going to be in the majority. So the African Union will be left with few countries. What is more important now is for the African Union to be able to identify why are the youth rebelling against their governments, what are their demands, and why is the military intervening as the only organized force in society which has a martial power. It is the only group that can, of course, take power because it has guns. And therefore, the African Union should be asking questions on why these coup d'etats are taking place. What are the responsibilities of the presidents? We have presidents who have stayed for 40 years plus in Africa. 30 years is almost the average now. So it's very important to look into the trajectories of power in economic governance, because these people eventually they make it a family dynasty, and the whole country is only to serve the interest of one family instead of the whole country. You cannot uplift the standard of living of the people. You cannot introduce more sophisticated manufacturing areas in hinterlands like industrial parks that would serve the nation. And then, of course, eventually what happens is when these people are removed, like in Gabon, for example, it is one family that owns literally the country. A country of 1 million plus people, and people are living in poverty there. And yet it has one of the highest exports of minerals, timber, and petroleum products. And so it is this kind of governance that is killing the economic transformation in Africa. Of course, now we have the potential. Investors are flooding into Africa, looking for the young population, looking for the natural resources that we have here. And then the position would be in a few years, we would see these young people emerging to take on power and develop some kind of a process of legitimacy so that economic development can happen more prolifically. Even in South Africa, a country was developed very well during apartheid. Of course, the bad news is that apartheid was not a good system of government. It denied rights to a whole entire population, indigenous population in Southern Africa. But the point is, now if we see the ANC track record, because it led the liberation of South Africa, it was very popular. For the first time now, the ANC has been contested and has been forced to form a power in liaison with other parties. It's lost its majority seat in parliament. So I think the basic economic transformation agenda in Africa is in the hands of the leadership of this continent. And they should make an effort to transform Africa into what it should be, into the potential it has. The biggest problem we have now is all of them, when they're called for summits by China or the United States, all our leaders are there, hoping that they will get some piece of dollars from these big countries. But they have the dollars in their country, they have the euro in the country, they have the resources. They have the minerals, they have the agricultural land, they have the forests. And it's only few countries that don't have resources which can be supported by other countries in Africa if we have that kind of unity. I'll tell you one example. The Inga Dam, which is found on the Congo River, can produce enough electricity to cover half of Africa. One dam, the Inga Dam. But the Inga Dam has only been partially developed by South Africa to supply energy to South Africa and not to the DRC. So the energy just bypasses its country of origin and it goes to supplies energy to South Africa. But if we can build for $100 billion that dam, half of Africa can be supplied by it. It can produce about 54,000 megawatts of electricity. So these are the kind of things that we need to think about economic development, first we have to have the infrastructure that's necessary for development, roads, railways, power generation and power transmission, water resource development. And then we need to have the kind of governance, people with the knowledge and the attitude that are running the country all the way from the federal level to the district level.
Yes, exactly. And I think like right now we need a new idea, like something that just, because as you have said, the coming generation is not asking for bread, for fuel, because now the question is way more than that. It's about identity. And one of the things that we can use to know ourselves, expand who we are, is through books. And you have written this book that we have right over here. I would love for us to talk about it. Unleashing Africa's Resilience.
Yeah.
A very heavy book.
Thank you.
So tell us about the concept and how you were first initiated to write this book.
Yeah, this book, this is basically a textbook, and I developed it when I was teaching public policy at the Addis Ababa University. I had 2 courses that I was teaching at the master's and PhD level, and these were Sustainable Development Administration, and then of course public administration in conjunction with public policy and institutional reforms. So the initiative for publishing the book was while I was preparing my lesson plans for the students, and of course the students that have been helping with their dissertation. Then I said, let me prepare this book and have it published. So this was published in 2013 for the African Union 50th anniversary. And at that time, one of the initiatives was my friends, and I was the chairman of the Anti-Corruption Advisory Board for the African Union in 2011, 2012, and therefore I said, what would be the kind of power that would unleash Africa's resilience? The kind of, you know, before governments came into the scene, before donors came into the scene, before colonialists, slave traders came into the scene, Africans had governments. Yeah. Aksum in Ethiopia was a major government. Dahomey in East Africa, in West Africa was a major. Shaka Zulu was a major government. These people were warriors and great leaders. But at that time, we didn't have the donors, we didn't have the NGOs, we didn't even have our own governments, but Africa was thriving. If you look at the examples of historical areas, like the Stele in Aksum, the Lalibela Church in Ethiopia, 12th century, we had people with the knowledge of architectural geometric skills who could build this kind of edifices. And therefore, we have the potential within this continent. That's why I said, what would it take? And therefore, I divided it into 15 chapters and started working on what are the challenges for African development. Of course, what are the existing measures that are being undertaken, and what are the potential trajectories for development that can happen. And therefore, the challenges are basically conflicts, you know. Some countries have been in conflicts throughout their history since the end of the colonial era. If we take Sudan, for example, it has been under military coups and counter coups. Over 15 military coups have taken place since independence. West Africa, you can cite many examples of this nature. East Africa, you can find other examples. Relatively, it was the SADC region, the South African Development Cooperation region, that has been more or less resilient in this. So this conflict is number one. Number two is the kind of corruption culture that has permeated governments in Africa. It's just mind-boggling to know that a few individuals are running countries like Nigeria. Goodluck Jonathan was the president. They said $20 billion disappeared from the bank. $20 billion. And then President Buhari came and said, I'm going to find the 20 billion, you just elect me. He stayed 2 terms and he didn't find it, and he left the country in economic chaos. Now you see Nigeria, you have so many riots this week that it is feared it will just replicate what happened in Kenya. So it's again leadership that put us into conflicts in this continent. So definitely what would be useful is, number one, we have to look into how these conflicts can be resolved. What are the foreign forces that are feeding in the flames of conflict in this continent? And what are the internal dynamics that are required to resolve these conflicts? 2, we have the agricultural land to produce sufficient food and, of course, to export and feed the rest of the world. But the problem is, every time you have some problem like the El Nino event, where you have drought in South Africa and rains in Ethiopia, in North Africa. In Ethiopia, you hear about landslides today. In South Africa, people couldn't get even a drop of rain. Why can't we have that kind of preparedness for seasons where food production could be hampered? So we don't have that kind of early warning, preparedness, and prevention mechanisms built into the economic principles of our governments. The other arena is the challenge of infrastructure in this continent. Of course, thanks to the Chinese, now we have a lot of infrastructure that's being built. Ethiopia alone has built more than 100,000 kilometers of roads, more than 100,000 kilometers of transmission lines, which are fed by 20 dams, which produce green energy. And of course, these are supposed to feed in the industrial parks and the cities and towns in Ethiopia. Of course, the management of this process has been less than desirable, where we have interruptions in power generation and power transmission. But definitely, some infrastructure has been built in this country. We have more than 50 universities now, more than 300 higher education institutions. These are churning hundreds of thousands of young students that are coming out, and they are trainable for 21st century industrial development, agro-industrial development. And therefore, my final conclusion is, one, to find a solution to the intermittent crisis that we have facing the African continent in terms of conflicts. Ethnicity is a very, very serious problem. We often hear about the genocide in Rwanda, but we have a lot of things going there which are really unnoticed in northern DRC, some other places in this continent. And therefore, it's very important to look into that. Number 2, most African leaders, there are only very few that could get the Mo Ibrahim Prize of $5 million for leaving office and creating a new democratic space for the coming government. It's not the norm in African politics. African leaders, by the time they're gone from office, they're either dead or in prison. When do you stop this military course and find responsible systems, not just the kind of elections that the Western governments parachute on Africa, but having the rules and institutions that would ensure a stable society within a constitutional government? And therefore, these are the kind of recommendations that are put into there. And we have a huge amount of diaspora, African diaspora. The reason is they can't live in their country, so they have to go and build another country. So they go to Western countries, they build the economies of Western countries, and of course, finally what they do is they send small monies to their families to help their families survive. We can bring this huge African diaspora back home to build it, but we have to have the enabling conditions for this diaspora to be able to work. If they can sell their skills to the American economy, there is no reason why they can't sell their skills to an African economy. And therefore, it's very important to have the diaspora to come back here. It's very important to engage our own youth that are graduated from different universities and educational, vocational institutions. It's also very important, in the end, to have the youth to create startups. Now in Senegal, Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa, Kenya, you have fintech startups that have generated over $1 billion in terms of investment. Africa is now the new destination for fintech investment. Over $1 billion, once they reach $1 billion investment, you call them what? A unicorn. And these guys are now leading the financial technology stride in Africa. So, but you have to have that enabling environment for this. Most African governments are still holding on to their ownership of essential instruments of development. That is wrong. And I have been advocating for this within the African Union, within the United Nations, and of course through my other writing. I have another volume of books that's coming out in terms of the economic transformation in Africa. It has become very difficult to go into the root cause of the serious challenge to African development. It has become so bureaucratized to the point that it even replicates everything what the United Nations is doing, what the African Development Bank is doing, what probably the IMF is also doing. So the African Union was established to liberate Africa. Now its sole issue is political, strategic, and of course areas of concern are peace and security.
I do believe that there are a lot of things that we can understand from this book. So our audience, I would love to, advise you guys to read this book. You can find it in Amazon. Thank you so much, Dr. Costantinos, for coming, for spending the time, for sharing your knowledge. Thank you so much. It really means a lot. My last question is going to be, what is your Africa?
Well, my Africa, you know, I've worked in 26 countries in Africa, and I believe I'm a Pan-Africanist. And we have started an organization called New Horizon for Pan-Africanism, which is going to have a new dimension in terms of bringing the Pan-Africanist agenda into the major discourse that we have in the continent. And therefore, if we talk about Pan-Africanism, I think we especially those in Ethiopia, we have special responsibility. The early phase of Pan-Africanism were called Ethiopianism, started by the South African Church, where they believed that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has been the harbinger of statehood within Ethiopia. It was the motive energy that helped Ethiopia to defend itself against invaders. Ethiopia has phase. It has a background to this. And it's this phase that has been a cementing factor among its people to maintain their independence, to have their 3,000 history written. And therefore, for me, Pan-Africanism is not just a question of liberating Africa economically, socially and politically, but it is to take the responsibility for our young people so that they could drive development in this continent, and it becomes the attraction of other communities to come into Africa and not our kids to go and run away from us. What we hear the story in the Red Sea, lots of children, young people disappearing with the challenge of the Red Sea crossing. You have the Mediterranean crossing where thousands are dying every year trying to get to Europe. If we can reverse this and bring them back to our continent to work, that's exactly the kind of view that I have, the kind of Africa I have. For me, Africa is not just a continent. Africa is a continent with history, a continent that has been subjected to slavery, colonialism, and all kinds of brutal dictatorships within our own people. And therefore, liberating Africa, during my lifetime, what I'd like to see is that young Africans, even if they want to go abroad, they will have to go and come back. You know, during Emperor Haile Selassie, most Ethiopians don't want to go to Europe or the United States. After finishing their studies, they don't even wait to get their diplomas in a ceremony. It was mailed to them. They quickly came back to their country. So this is this kind of love for your country that should be developed within our African youth. And in that New Horizon for Pan-Africanism, my effort is to be able to generate this process so that it could go like wildfire among African civil societies and African organizations, be it think tanks or universities. We're going to do this in every country. I'm also part of the Scout movement. We have more than 120,000 Scouts in Ethiopia now, in different schools. And we teach them about citizenship, responsible citizenship. We teach them about spending their time in a more responsible place. We teach them as messengers of peace. This is the emblem they have, the messengers of peace. And we want these young people to grow as messengers of peace and not as people who learn from others who are wielding guns and fighting each other. So that's the vision I have for Africa, where we can stop conflicts and try to develop our resources so that we have the extended family structure in Africa. You can't even live alone. People are in a big family in Africa. The kind of now diseases that are rampant in the Western world, where you have people, they are depressed, they are distressed, they are having all kinds of challenges. In Africa, that can't happen. We have a unitary community within which people now are not even allowed to be even lonely. And therefore, these are the kind of systems, and to develop the faith we have, whatever kind of religion we follow. Of course, ultimately, we have all one creator that we believe in. And therefore, it's very important to create this kind of narrative, an African philosophy which would unite Africans together, not just because of our color, but because of our history, because of our culture, because of what really happened before colonialism, the kind of intact communities we had, the kind of generous communities who shared their resources, and of course who share their values too. And I think that is the ultimate goal, if I can contribute even in the most modest way for this.
Yes, oh my goodness, that's a very nice way to conclude our show.
Thank you
you so much again. I hope definitely we'll meet back again with your new book and some other big projects, definitely.
Sure.
So our audience, our today's coffee time looked like the one you just watched. When we conclude our idea, liberating ourselves is contributing for African Renaissance. In order for us to see the Africa we want, everything starts within us. So let's work on ourselves. Let's liberate ourselves from the chains that is holding us back from becoming our true self. That's when we can see our Africa back to that height that she has been before. Thank you so much for watching. Until I see you guys next week with another coffee time, with another guest. I think it's time for me to say goodbye. Bye. Cheers.
Thank you.
It was a very nice day.